First, let me bring in Chuck Rosenberg. He's a former U.S. attorney, senior FBI official. He's now an MSNBC contributor. And joining me also is Ken Dilanian, intelligence and national security reporter for NBC News. He helped break the story about the upcoming Mueller report, along with our colleague Pete Williams. Ken, let me start with you on the whole back and forth about the acting attorney general here in Matt Whitaker. What is the ultimate fallout inside the Justice Department when they now know you have ethics officials who said, well, you know, if you were to press us, we would have recommended recusal, but it's ultimately up to you. What does that mean going forward?
Oh, I think it's very significant, Chuck, because, you know, prosecutors take the appearance of impartiality, the appearance of impropriety extremely seriously. And that's what you had here. You didn't have a legal reason that he had to recuse. You had a bunch of criticism of a pending investigation. He essentially prejudged the Mueller investigation. Now he's supervising it. And the ethics official in the Justice Department said, you know what, this is a close call, but on balance, I think you should step aside. And he said, thanks for your advice, but I'm disregarding it. Now, you know, he's told associates that he understands that he's under a microscope with this investigation, right, and every move he makes is going to be learned by the Hill. And I think that's one of the reasons why, if you notice, he's left Rod Rosenstein essentially in charge of the sort of day-to-day management, right, or supervisory role of the Mueller investigation. But he still has authority over major decisions, like whether to subpoena the president. And the question is, will we know if he's blocking any of those decisions, right, or what decisions he's making there?
Chuck Rosenberg, considering that the ethics officials concluded that out of an abundance of caution, Mr. Whitaker should probably recuse himself, what would they say about Bill Barr if he's confirmed to be Attorney General, considering he wrote essentially a legal analysis for the president and his legal team about the Mueller probe?
You know, Chuck, very good question. I mean, that might come out the same way. Here's what I mean. What Bill Barr wrote is something that I strongly disagree with, but it's not crazy. I mean, it's a very robust view of the Article 2 authorities of a chief executive. You know, serious, sober people hold that view. I don't share it, but I understand it. So that said, it might be a similar situation where the ethics officials say to Attorney General Barr, you know, there's no mandatory recusal. Right. You're not required to step down. But similar to Matt Whitaker, there is an appearance issue. And by the way, going back to Matt Whitaker and what Ken said, Ken is spot on. And his analysis is exactly right. You don't want to get close to the line when you're a prosecutor. You don't want to even be able to see the line. And so if someone suggests to you that there's an appearance problem, the smart thing, the prudent thing to do is to recuse yourself. It's not that hard.
Chuck, though, let me ask this. I asked you about Bill Barr's legal analysis. What if that's coupled with the fact that he also met the president and essentially interviewed with him to be his lead personal lawyer in the Mueller? Are those two, now that you put those two facts together, do you think, would that still lead to the same decision, or do you think they would be officially making the recommendation that you need to recuse?
Yeah, so you're much closer to a mandatory recusal when you're talking about either a financial or a personal or a political relationship. If Bill Barr was interviewed to be Trump's lawyer, for instance, I don't know that to be true, but you know, bear with me on the hypothetical. Right. And learn things from the president that he would only have learned as a precursor to an attorney-client relationship, I think you're much, much closer to a situation where you might have to step down. But again, you're still going to have an appearance question. And we're not talking about some trial attorney in the bowels of the Department of Justice. We're talking about the Attorney General of the United States. Right. Bill Barr is a very principled man. I truly believe that. Yeah. But I think there are some very serious questions you're going to have to ask him at a Senate confirmation hearing. And I worry deeply about the appearance of a conflict.
Ken, let's move to yours and Pete's scoop from last night having to do with the Mueller report. Appears to be coming sooner rather than later. What should that tell us about the remaining handful of people that have never interviewed with him and have always been rumored to be potential targets? Roger Stone, Donald Trump Jr. in particular, perhaps even a Jared Kushner.
Well, Jared Kushner did have a 7-hour interview. I had almost forgotten that, Chuck, when I was reviewing the bidding here. And But it doesn't tell us anything definitive. But most legal experts would say, if you look like you could be an important witness in a case, but you haven't been interviewed, you might be a target. And just because Robert Mueller, as we've reported, is expected to file a report to the Justice Department by mid-February doesn't mean he's not also going to file a series of indictments. We just don't know. And in fact, I was surprised, frankly, when we learned or were told that, and it's not just lawyers in the case, believe me, the Justice Department officials have been told to be ready for Mueller to file his report in February. And don't forget, he does it confidentially to the Attorney General, who then decides what to do with it. And it doesn't mean that necessarily that's the end of all the investigations. In fact, the Southern District of New York appears to be proceeding on a different track. You'll have the New York Attorney General, and there may be loose ends of the Mueller investigation. In fact, Mike Flynn won't be sentenced for at least 3 months. But it does appear that we're reaching some sort of end game on the central questions of this investigation: Russia collusion and obstruction of justice.
Chuck Rosenberg, add your expertise as a former prosecutor here. What is it if we know the report's coming basically in about 50 to 60 days? How would you be feeling if you were Donald Trump Jr. knowing that fact now?
Well, I'm not sure I would be very happy to be Donald Trump Jr. under any circumstance, Chuck. But, going after Ken is pretty easy because I have to agree just with the smart things he said. There are tentacles of this case in different parts of the country. And so the mere fact that Mueller may write a report or a part of a report or a chapter of a report doesn't mean that there isn't more prosecuting and investigating to come. I think, the Eastern District of Virginia has a piece. The Southern District of New York clearly has a big piece. And, by the way, don't forget about state prosecutors, including the Attorney General of the state of New York. And so my guess is that being Donald Trump Jr. or somebody who's part of the Trump Foundation or the Trump Organization is not a very comfortable place to be right now.
Ken Delaney and Chuck Rosenberg, I will let you guys go on this. Hello, YouTubers. If you're watching this, it means you've checked out our channel, so thank you. Now do me a favor, subscribe by clicking on that button down there. Click on any of the videos to watch the latest interviews and highlights from MTP Daily and MSNBC. You can get more Meet the Press content every morning in the First Read newsletter. If you're tired of content that you don't know anything about where it came from, you don't have to have that problem with us. NBC News, MSNBC, MTP, and the Meet the Press mindset right here for you on YouTube. Subscribe now.